The night was thick and heavy, like resin, and every sound echoed in it strangely, as if the ground beneath the Crusaders' camp had risen under the weight of the spilled blood. Somewhere far away on the hills, the last moans of the dying were fading away. But inside the camp, life was only starting. Large torches were burning along the perimeter, throwing red reflections on the rough tents, and it seemed that the entire camp was drowning in a bloody swamp. The women, taken from the destroyed villages, were kneeling, tied to stakes driven into the earth, and tried not to raise their eyes. They knew that a glance could be seen as a challenge, and a challenge was too costly. At first, there was only the sound of weapons, the flash of a knife, the creak of chainmail, and heavy footsteps. The Crusaders, returning from robbery, entered the camp with loud laughter and drunken cries, as if war was a kind of amusement for them. But behind their joy there was something else, dark and cruel. Soon came the sound of drums, dull and even, like the heartbeat of some creature awakened among men. Each beat hit through the bodies of the women, making the blood move quicker and chill inside their veins. They understood that the drums were calling not for prayer and not for announcements. They called for night rituals. One warrior, tall, with a long beard and a face cut by a scar, came closer to the line of captives. His eyes glowed in the firelight as if the flame of hell was reflected in them. He roughly grabbed one woman by the hair, making her cry from pain, and dragged her toward the middle of the camp, where others were already gathering. The rest of the captives froze, afraid to breathe. In every chest one thought repeated, "Only not me, not tonight." The tent in the center was covered with dark cloth, and above it there was a cross, roughly carved from a bloody piece of wood. The cross was covered with torn clothes, dirty and covered with blood, and none of the women doubted that they belonged to those who had not survived the last nights. Dozens of candles were burning inside the tent, and the air was thick with the smell of wax, smoke, and something else, sweet and decayed, the smell of blood that the priest, dressed in white rags, did not manage to wash away. His robe was covered with stains that could no longer be removed, and his eyes were cold, without any pity. He lifted his hands toward the sky and began to read the Psalms. But his voice sounded as though the words were taken from another book, from another shrine. His speech mixed with the noise of the drums, and the women's heads were spinning. With every word, their fear grew stronger, because they knew that what was happening had nothing to do with the God they had been told about. It was a dark, twisted faith, born in the hearts of people who had lost everything human. The woman, dragged by the bearded man, was forced to her knees in the middle of the circle. Her hands were tied with leather straps, and the skin beneath them immediately turned white from the pressure. She tried to say something, begged for mercy, but her words were lost in the laughter of the warriors. One of them struck her on the face, and blood appeared on her lip. The drums sounded louder. Other prisoners began to be lifted and placed around, forming a circle. The skin on their shoulders trembled in the firelight. Their eyes filled with tears. They realized that the closer they were to the middle, the less chance they had to live through the night. The shadows from the torches stretched on the ground, intertwining, and it seemed that the camp was already filled with creatures that should not exist among soldiers. The warriors standing nearby resembled a pack of predators. Their breathing was heavy. They spoke to each other as if discussing something amusing, a game where every victim was just a piece, a toy. One of them took a jug of wine and poured some of it on the ground, as though as an offering to spirits, then drank the rest, wiping his lips with his hand. Another took out a pot heated until it was white and lifted it toward the sky. The priest blessed it, saying words that made the women's hair rise on their necks. The women froze. They knew that it would begin soon. No one knew how long they would need to bear it. Sometimes the rituals continued until sunrise, sometimes until the death of the first victim. But each night they repeated, and each night took away a piece of the human soul, one from the captives. A young girl with golden hair lifted her eyes to the heavens, as if seeking help. But the sky was covered with thick clouds, and not a single star dared to shine over this camp. She knew. Even God had turned his face away from this place. A howl came from outside. The wind howled, as if crying together with the prisoners. The drums did not cease, and the hearts of every woman beat in time with that evil rhythm. With every beat, everything became clearer. The night had only started, and before them waited not just pain. They awaited torment that would turn them into shadows of themselves, if they were to stay alive at all. And when the first drop of blood touched the earth, the shadows around the tent moved, as though alive. And the cold inside each soul was replaced by a terrible understanding. They were not alone. In the camp of the Crusaders ruled not only men, but also that which was fed by this horror, filling every night with a new darkness. The priest lowered his hands, and the drums stopped so suddenly that the following silence was more deafening than any strike. The women who stood in the circle felt how everything inside them was tearing apart. Even the crackling of the torches seemed too loud, too alive in that silence. But soon the priest's voice filled the tent again. His speech was almost a chant, and the words, though similar to psalms, were distorted and became wild. He spoke about sacrifice, about purity, about how the women must go through cleansing, through fire and iron. Otherwise their souls would never be saved. These words were like a verdict from which there was no escape. One of the warriors came up to a girl who stood closest to the center. Her shoulders trembled, and she tried to move back, but the leather straps did not allow her. The man held her chin, lifted her face upward, and there was no mercy in his eyes. He said something in Latin, a short prayer, and at that moment another warrior brought a heated iron rod to her cheek. The woman screamed. The sound of her cry pierced the night and broke out, as if the ground itself shuddered. But instead of stopping, the Crusaders laughed, and the priest blessed that cry, as though it were a hymn. The skin on her face burned with pain, and the smell of burned flesh filled the tent. The other captives started to weep and shut their eyes, but the warriors forced them to look. One roughly raised the chin of another woman, ordering her to watch her neighbor's suffering. At that moment they realized that the torment was not only physical. They were broken from within, forced to see and hear every agony. When the first stage of torture ended, the priest raised a cup of wine, but the wine was not pure. There was already blood floating in it, collected from wounds. He lifted it high and spoke words as though dedicating the drink to heaven, and passed the cup around. Each warrior took a sip, leaving traces of lips and blood on the edges of the cup. The women, filled with disgust, watched this, realizing that for the Crusaders all that was happening was not a crime, but a holy ritual. After that, a new phase began. The drums sounded again, and the warriors began to move around the women, tightening the circle smaller and smaller. They shouted words that sounded like spells, and every drumbeat seemed to pierce the skull, driving fear deeper inside. The women no longer tried to scream. Their voices broke, their bodies trembled, but they had no strength to resist. It seemed that the night was consuming them. The priest pointed toward the next prisoner. She was pushed forward, her arms and legs tied so tightly that she could hardly stand upright. An iron cross was placed on the ground, heated in the fire, and she was forced to kneel upon it. Pain overwhelmed her. Her skin immediately began to smoke, but the warriors held her, not letting her move. One of them pressed her head down to the ground, forcing her to look into the eyes of the other women. Her face was distorted by pain. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but her gaze was filled with despair and a silent question. Why is God silent? There was no reply, only drums and laughter. Each new torture came together with prayer. Every scream was accepted as a blessing. They said that these women were being cleansed of sin, though in truth they were tortured for amusement, turning the ritual into a celebration of cruelty. And the more they screamed, the brighter the priest's eyes shone. It seemed as if he was feeding on their agony. His voice grew louder, more powerful, as if every torment brought him closer to something unholy. The women started to lose all sense of time. Some fainted and fell to the ground, but were awakened by buckets of cold water so that the torment could go on. No one was allowed to leave the circle before the end of the ritual. Even death was not always a release. One dead body was tied to a pole, forcing the others to look into the empty, glassy eyes that seemed to accuse the living for still breathing. Near midnight, the ritual became even more violent. The warriors pulled out their knives and began to carve crosses on the women's skin, symbols which, as they claimed, would free their souls. But each cut line turned into another scar, another wound where blood mixed with dirt. Some women fell helplessly, but were raised again and again, forced to stay on their feet. The circle turned into an arena of torment, and every step, every motion was soaked with horror. One woman tried to escape. She rushed to the side, knocking down one of the warriors. Her cry was wild with madness. "Let me go! I can't bear it anymore." But her flight lasted only a few seconds. She was seized, grabbed by the hair, and dragged back. For her attempt to resist, the punishment was even harsher. She was tied to a wooden cross. Her arms were stretched wide, and each warrior in turn struck her with a whip. Blood streamed down her body, and the earth beneath the cross grew dark with her pain. The other women stood silent, frozen in terror, realizing that any act of defiance would end the same way. The ritual seemed endless. The captives stopped recognizing the faces of their torturers. They became like ghosts, like demons surrounding them. Only the drums and the priest's voice stayed unchanged, reminding them that the night was still far from its end. Some prisoners began to see illusions. They saw figures rising from the shadows, taking shape in the torchlight, forms of beasts, as if the darkness itself had come to share the feast. Yet even then, a faint spark of hope remained. Someone prayed for themselves. Someone whispered the name of a child or husband left behind in the destroyed village. Those words could not change anything, but they gave strength to live another moment, to endure another beat of the drum. In the morning, when the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, the women were barely alive. Their bodies were covered with burns, scars, and bleeding wounds. Yet the ritual was still not finished. The priest lifted his hands to the sky and proclaimed that the night had been favorable to the Lord. He ordered that the women remain in the circle until dawn, so that their blood and pain would nourish the earth. The warriors dispersed, laughing and drunk, and soon their steps and voices faded into the distance. The women stayed lying in the circle, half dead, listening as the drums finally went silent. The quiet that followed after all that horror was dreadful, too lifeless, too hollow. It felt as though the night had left a mark on their hearts that could never fade. They knew, tomorrow everything would happen again, and only death could set them free. The fires in the camp burned brighter and brighter, and it seemed that the night had chosen never to end. The air was thick, heavy with smoke, blood, and wine. The women, left standing in a circle after the night's torture, could hardly stay on their feet. Their faces were pale, their eyes swollen from tears, their bodies trembling, covered with wounds and burns. But this was only the beginning of another wave of madness. The Crusaders had no intention of stopping. When the drums struck again, everyone who still hoped for rest understood that this night would be even worse than the last. At first, the warriors brought out a wooden table, heavy and roughly carved from planks, and set it right in the center of the circle. On top of it, they placed a coarse cloth stained with dark marks. None of the women doubted that it was the blood of those who had been there before them. The table turned into an altar, and its appearance caused a new wave of fear. The priest appeared once more in white, though his robe was almost black from stains. He lifted his hands toward the sky, and his voice pierced through the night. He spoke about sacrifice, that every woman in the circle must become a symbol of redemption for the entire earth, which the Crusaders had washed with blood. His words sounded like a verdict. Every new phrase deepened the horror, and the women understood. Their suffering was to become part of a dark ritual, in which they were not human beings, but only bodies, vessels for pain. The first victim was brought to the altar. It was the same girl with golden hair who last night had looked up at the sky, praying for help. Now her hands and hair were being pulled while she tried to resist. She screamed, pressing her feet against the ground, but she was dragged like a lifeless doll. She was laid on the table and tied with leather straps to the boards so that she could not move. Her face was twisted in terror. Tears streamed without end. The priest took a knife from beneath his robes. The blade gleamed in the torchlight, and the women standing in the circle shuddered and closed their eyes. But it was even more terrifying to open them again. The blade touched the girl's skin, and a thin line of blood ran along her body. She screamed so loudly that even the drums stopped for a moment, as if allowing her cry to reign over the camp. The warriors laughed, encouraging the priest. They shouted Latin words, demanding new victims. The priest leaned over the girl and began to carve a cross into her chest. Slowly, carefully, as though creating a symbol meant to be offered to his god. The women in the circle trembled, their knees shaking. They tried to look away, but the warriors again and again lifted their chins, forcing them to watch. It was part of the ritual. Each one had to be a witness to the suffering of the other. When the symbol was finished, the priest collected the blood into a bowl. He raised it high, as if offering it to the heavens. And at that moment the women felt a chill running down their backs. It seemed that the darkness around them thickened, and the air became heavier. The camp no longer belonged to humans. The warriors drank from the bowl in large gulps, and their laughter grew louder, their eyes more crazed. They were no longer soldiers. They were a pack of beasts possessed by something ancient and terrible. Next, an older woman was led forward, her black hair falling over her face, hiding her eyes. She did not scream or resist, as if she accepted her fate, but that only enraged the Crusaders. They wanted fear, cries, resistance. She was thrown to the ground, and one of the warriors kicked her in the stomach to make her scream. But even then, her lips stayed tightly closed. That silence made them furious. In the end, they tied her tightly and began to carve symbols directly on her arms and legs until her blood poured in streams. Her silence became her only form of defiance, but it merely turned her into a living target for their fury. The women in the circle understood that both resistance and silence led to the same end, death. The only difference was how long they would have to suffer. Then the true nightmare began. The warriors brought long iron chains and hung one of the captives by her arm so that her body dangled in the air. She jerked and tried to lift her knees, but the weight of the chains pulled her downward, tearing her shoulders. Her screams filled the entire space, and every drumbeat echoed with a new jolt of her body. The Crusaders came to her one after another and made cuts on her skin, as though leaving their signatures. She could no longer scream, her voice had broken, but her eyes were wide with madness. Staring into the emptiness, the priest said that these tortures opened the gates of heaven. But the women knew that no gates were opening there. A terrible feeling grew inside them, that something was waiting beyond the fires. Their blood and suffering were not an offering to God, but nourishment for something else, for the darkness that was drawing nearer. Some of the women began to see strange things. The fire in the torches wavered and distorted, taking the shape of faces that laughed and whispered. Shadows around the tent shifted on their own, as though there were more bodies in the camp than there truly were. They heard whispers, voices that no human mouth could form. These sounds drove them insane, and they no longer knew where reality ended and madness began. At some point, one of the women fell to her knees and began to pray. Her voice shook, her words broke apart, yet she still begged God to intervene. The Crusaders laughed, and the priest came up to her and made her kiss the edge of his knife. The blade cut her lips, and blood trickled down her chin. "This is your prayer," he said, and her prayer turned into a moan of agony. Near dawn, the ritual reached its highest point. All the women in the circle were bleeding, exhausted, many barely breathing. But the priest would not allow the ritual to end. He ordered them to bring out a huge wooden cross from the wall. It was carried into the center of the camp, and 2 prisoners were nailed to it at once, their arms and legs stretched apart. Their bodies were crossed, looking like sacrificial figures, deliberately displayed before the camp. The priest chanted louder and louder. His voice was no longer human, hoarse and broken, as if someone else spoke through him. The women standing in the circle felt the ground trembling beneath their feet. The sky was covered with clouds, and it seemed that morning would never come. They understood that on that night they were not merely tortured. They were part of something greater, a ritual meant to open the gates of darkness. When the first rays of sunlight finally pierced the clouds, the camp looked like a battlefield. The women lay scattered on the ground, some dead, others still alive, but all looking like shadows. The priest stood in the center, bleeding, holding a raised knife. His eyes shone with insanity, and his lips whispered words that no one could understand. The warriors lay down to sleep, drunk and laughing, as if nothing dreadful had occurred. But the women knew the night would return, and the next one would be even more horrifying. That night the wind was different. It no longer carried the smell of burnt villages or the distant cries. It was heavy, filled with whispers that no one spoke aloud. The Crusaders' camp began to awaken for another ritual. The women, barely breathing after the previous tortures, sat once more in a circle, tied with belts, staring into the fire. Their eyes were empty, but somewhere deep inside a trace of fear still glowed, the fear that kept them from falling fully into madness. The bonfires burned higher than before. The tongues of flame reached toward the sky, but the light they gave grew weaker and weaker. The shadows around the tents grew thicker and heavier, as though they had cut the camp off from the rest of the world. The women felt that this night would be different, unlike all those before. Something trembled inside them, as if their hearts already knew. The end was near. The priest appeared, as always, with raised hands. His white face had long since lost any sign of purity. It was now brown-red, layered with blood. His expression was rigid, and his eyes burned with fanatical fire. But this time his voice sounded different. He did not read psalms and did not speak about God. His words were low, hollow, and each sound echoed strangely, in a way no one could explain. The women trembled. It seemed that he was not speaking in a human tongue. The drums struck, but their rhythm was unusual, beating not like before, when they set the pace of torture. Now they sounded like the heartbeat of something vast and ancient. The warriors laughed, shouted curses and Latin words, jumping around the fires. Their faces twisted in the light, and the women noticed for the first time that their laughter had changed. There was nothing human left in it. The first victim that night did not even cry out. She fainted as soon as she was brought to the altar. The warriors lifted her body and tied it to the table, but she did not move. Her lips were blue, her breath barely audible. The priest leaned over her, whispered something, and suddenly her body arched sharply. She screamed, as if awakening from a nightmare, but it turned out that the nightmare was only beginning. The blood rushed faster through her veins. Her eyes rolled back, and she began to convulse, as if an invisible force tortured her from within. The women standing in a circle screamed. Some began to pray, others shut their eyes. But the warriors only laughed louder. They clapped their hands like during a feast. One of them shouted that it was a sign from heaven, and the others echoed him. But the women knew it was not heaven. Suddenly, something else began to enter this world. The shadows of the tents moved. At first, it could seem like a trick of the fire, but soon the shapes grew clearer. They were thin and long, with hands like tentacles. They slid silently over the ground. The women saw them first and screamed even louder. But the warriors laughed, noticing nothing. Only the priest froze. His eyes widened. He realized what he had summoned. One of the warriors fell. His laughter broke off, and he clutched at his throat. Blood poured from his mouth, though no one had touched him. He convulsed on the ground, and at first the others thought he was drunk. But when his body began to twist at unnatural angles, the laughter ended. There was no warrior anymore, only his armor drenched in blood. Screams spread throughout the camp. The warriors reached for their weapons, but the shadows were faster. They rushed into the circle of firelight, stretching out their long limbs and seizing people. Those they caught disappeared into the darkness, their screams fading, as if they were being torn apart somewhere else. The women watched, their hearts pounding, but inside them a strange feeling arose. For the first time in many nights they were no longer victims. Now the executioners had become prey. The priest fell to his knees, continuing to chant the spell. He tried to command it, but his voice drowned in the roar that came from everywhere, as if the earth itself sang a grim song. The warriors shouted, swung their swords, but their strikes went through the shadows. Every attempt to fight ended with their bodies torn apart or swallowed by the dark. The women sat in a circle, bound together, unable to believe their eyes. One by one the tormentors fell. Some tried to run, but the darkness overtook them beyond the camp. Screams echoed far into the night, but stopped suddenly, as if the void itself had devoured them. The priest screamed the loudest. His face contorted, foam spilled from his mouth. He lifted a knife, intending to drive it into his own chest, but did not have time. The shadow wrapped around his arms, and the knife fell to the ground. He was pulled into the darkness, and his scream became the last sound the women heard from their torturers. He screamed in a way that no human could, as if his voice had been torn and twisted. Then everything fell silent. The bonfires went out one after another, as if a great cold wind had blown them away. The women were left standing in the thick darkness, where only breathing and quiet sobs broke the dead stillness. No one dared to move. They waited for another strike, waited for the shadows to come for them. But the darkness did not touch them. When dawn came, the camp was empty. Where the tents had stood, only torn cloth, burnt stakes, and a circle of blood and ash remained. No bodies, no screams. Everything was gone. The women were left alone among the ruins. Their leather straps were broken, as if unseen hands had released them. They looked at one another, unable to believe in their rescue. They left the place in silence. No one spoke, no one dared to look back. Behind them remained a ring of ash that smoked for a long time. And they all knew that what had happened during the night was not a dream. It was vengeance. Since then, people spoke of the Crusaders' camp in a whisper. Travelers avoided that place even when it was the shorter road. No one wished to be where, at night, drums could be heard though no one beat them, and cries that should not exist. The women who had survived that night could never sleep peacefully again. In every rustle, in every gust of wind, they heard the same whisper that had ended their tormentors. They had survived, but everyone knew that their souls would remain forever in that circle.